Good evening. You have opened the subject of the transcendental. That's what this really amounts to. The transcendental. And because it fits right into the entire teaching of the infinite way, I think it would be a good idea to talk a little about this transcendental, because on the understanding of it hinges your entire success in living the infinite way or living spiritually, certainly on healing spiritually. You will remember I said last night that the only way that Goliath can be destroyed is by using a weapon no larger than a tiny pebble. And I explained that I didn't mean a physical one, but rather a stone carved out of the side of a mountain without hands. Now you must remember that to material sense, this is not only impossible but stupid. You'll always find that the things of God are foolishness with man. Nevertheless, it is true that we have patients and students in England and Africa, Australia, New Zealand, United States, Canada, and we are separated from them by 2 to 10,000 miles. And yet we are engaged in a spiritual healing activity with them and meeting with a fair amount of success in it. Now remember that it isn't possible to have a physical contact with these people or with their bodies. And remember also that it isn't a simple matter to transfer your thoughts for thousands of miles, so that not much success would be attained even with mental powers. Now, if there are no physical powers used and no mental powers, with what are you left? Spiritual power. But is spiritual power something that a man or woman can use? The answer is no. Quick, no. No man or woman can use spiritual power. But spirit can use individual consciousness through which and as which to operate. But spirit cannot be seen, heard, tasted, touched, or smelled. If spirit is a power at all, it is an invisible power, an inaudible power, and certainly not one that a human being could physically or mentally take hold of to use. Now, this is what we call transcendental power. And it certainly transcends anything that a human being is capable of. And yet a human being, or what appears to us as a human being, can be the instrument, the avenue, through which or as which this spirit can operate. Now, In scriptural language, this transcendental presence and power has been called I am. It has been called God. It has been called Christ, Spirit, Tao, Brahm, Messiah, a presence or the presence that goes before us to make the crooked places straight. The reason it has so many names is that no one can define it. Lao Tzu says if you can name it, it isn't that. Do you know why that statement is true? Because anything that you name is a mental image or concept in your own mind. It is something you have made, you have created. How then can it be how can it be that infinite thing or being we call spirit? It is the same with God. We use the word God, and we use synonyms for God: mind, spirit, soul, law, principle, substance, reality. Is God any of those things? Certainly not. Those are just names which we use to identify certain qualities and activities of God. God is none of those things, and God isn't even all of them combined. What is God? And you can see how impossible it is to answer. That is why Jesus had to turn away when he was asked, "What is truth?" He could have answered. He could have said, "I am." And then they would have said just what they did say later. He makes himself as God. Let us stone him and crucify him. He makes himself equal with God. And of course, even if he had said, "I am," he would not have been referring to a human personality, to physical powers or mental powers, physical presence or mental presence. He would have been referring to that transcendental spirit which I am. We speak of the stone that is carved out of the side of a mountain without hands, and we say of it in Scripture that eventually it is it that is going to destroy the 4 temporal kingdoms. That means every aspect of materiality, every aspect of material sense is to be destroyed by a stone, a rock that is carved out of the side of a mountain without hands. What can that be but spirit? Elsewhere in Scripture it is called the still small voice. God is not in the whirlwind. God is not in physical powers. God is not in mental powers. God is in the still small voice. And in one of the Psalms it says, "He uttered his voice, the earth melted." There is a psalm which has in it a whole page of what God does when he utters his voice. He spake, and this happened. He uttered his voice, and this happened. He spake, he said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The still small voice was uttered, spoken. But did it come out of a human throat? And was it meant for human ears? No. No. It was uttered in the inner sanctuary or temple of man's being, and it was meant only for his soul. Now, spiritual living is based on the actual experience of living by virtue of that still small voice. When a person attains the state of consciousness where they are living purely by spiritual means, there is a transcendental presence and power that may speak within as a voice, or it may announce itself as an impression. Paul attained that state of consciousness, as you know by his statement, "I live, yet not I, Christ liveth in me." Most of you have witnessed some of that in my experience. You have witnessed how at times I have gone here, there, or the other place for class or lectures, and probably you have racked your brains to learn why at that particular time I went to that particular place when I might have gone somewhere else and had a class twice as large, 5 times as large. Perhaps you've wondered why I've gone to far, far away places where there were only a few students when I could have been in Chicago or New York with hundreds, or California with thousands. And the answer is this: I don't go where it is humanly wise or humanly profitable. I go where I'm sent. Either I'm told in plain language where to go, or I receive an impression, or I just find myself doing it. It is like the experience before I went to Africa on the first trip. We had, to my knowledge, only about 15 or 20 students in South Africa. Certainly I had never heard from any more than that, and had no knowledge that there were any more. And yet one day I had a letter from a man saying, and it was a student, saying that when you are in Europe sometime, why don't you jump down to us here in South Africa? Of course, it's a very small jump. It's only about 10,000 miles. And somehow or other, I didn't ridicule that letter. And when I was in the office, the air ticket office, arranging my trip to Europe, I said to the clerk, if I wanted to go to South Africa, how would I get home from there? Oh, you could come home through India and Japan. Well, how much extra would that ticket be? Well, the entire ticket would only be $1,500 more to go from Europe down to South Africa, over to Pakistan, India, Siam, up into China, Japan, and back to Hawaii. Why? I said, that's not anything. Let me have one of those. And that's how that trip was arranged. Now listen to this carefully. When I got to New York, we had a class, and there was a letter there from our book department in California, and They said, what are we to do with this order? And it was an order from a bookstore in South Africa for 200 copies each of all titles, including the $7.50 manuscripts. Well, I said, somebody thinks I'm Billy Graham, going down there and attract thousands. Pay no attention to this, just send them 20 copies each. And so they wrote a letter by air saying they were sending, at Mr. Goldsmith's request, 20 copies each instead of 200. By the time I got to London, I was bombarded with letters and cablegrams and finally telephones. What's wrong with us down here? Isn't our credit any good? Don't you want our business? Why? Well, we're ordering 200 of each title. We're getting 20. Well, I said, what do you want with 200 copies each? And then they told me that they had over 100 students booked for closed class in Johannesburg and over 100 in Cape Town, beside lecture audiences. And they had to have 200 titles of each, and I had to go around London not only getting all the wholesale, but buying up retail so as to fill those needs. And when I got down there, I found 800 students ready to hear me. Yeah? Now, you know, it sounds ridiculous, don't you, to spend $1,500 to go down to visit 15 or 20 or 30 students. But you see, the human mind didn't know what the transcendental mind knew. That was the time and that was the place to be in South Africa, and I was there. And in less than a year, I was back there on a second trip. That's how important that has become. Now, it happens in other ways too. As a matter of fact, my entire life is guided by that inner presence and spirit that virtually tells me every step I have to take, and does it in very plain English too. I'm like Joan of Arc in that I don't know whether God speaks in English, but at least I understand him in English. Now, at a certain point in our development, if we're on the spiritual path, and if we're on it not for some purpose of gain or fame or name, I mean, if we have just turned to the Spirit for the one purpose of finding out what is the Spirit, or is there a Spirit, or how does one live in the Spirit, and has no motive in doing it, and I can assure you that in my days of study I had none. I wasn't thinking of a public work or desiring one. I just had this curiosity, if you call it that, leading to find the Spirit. The day does come when you do not live by your own wisdom or intelligence. You live by a power of grace, and it knows what you should do and where you should be at every given moment, and it knows how to keep you away from the places you shouldn't be and at the time you shouldn't be there. Now, when it comes to spiritual living, then, this presence within is the guide and the director. It leads, it governs, it protects, it maintains, it sustains. It is necessary that one feel a confidence in it, because sometimes it says things to us that are not humanly sensible, and you have to go forward with it just the same. On the other hand, you cannot do this if you're afraid of failure. Anybody who's afraid of failure shouldn't go in for the spiritual life, because it is possible not for the Spirit to fail, but that we might misunderstand or misinterpret and make a mistake. And so if we're afraid of making mistakes, if we're afraid of having a failure now and then, or afraid of backtracking, we better not go in it, because there can well be such occasions when we do not rightly interpret or follow It never fails, but we can. Now, if we have attachments, we have no right to go into the spiritual life either, because the attachments do not permit us to remain attached. That means this, that when this still small voice utters itself, you have to obey. And if you have friends or relatives who don't like it, you have your choice to make between the spirit and the voice. And sometimes that can mean exactly what the Master said, leaving mother and brother and sister and father and husband and wife for my sake. Now, that doesn't mean that in every case we have to abandon our families. But if families do put up, or friends, or relatives, or business partners, if they do put up barriers to our spiritual development, we have to make the choice. Choose ye this day whom you will serve, God or mammon. And to the person who has had this thing, there is no choice. There's only one way to go, and it makes no difference what stands in the way, or who, or what sacrifices are to be made, or whether there are lions' dens to climb into, or burning fires to climb out of, or crucifixes to mount. None of that counts. The only thing that counts is obedience to this still small voice. When it comes to spiritual healing, you will find that it does the work. You couldn't possibly heal a ruptured appendix. You couldn't possibly remove gallstones. You couldn't possibly remove tumors and cancers or reduce fevers. No human being can do that without physical means. But once this transcendental spirit is upon you, you will remember what the Master said. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, and I am ordained to heal the sick, to comfort the comfortless. And he could have gone on and to say, to feed the hungry, to heal the blind and the deaf, and raise the dead, and to open spiritual vision to those who are dead in materiality. Man doesn't do that and can't do it, but this still small voice can and does wherever consciousness is open to receive it. Now, to those who have received the realization of the presence of God, those who have an actual conscious awareness of this presence, all there is to healing is the ability to sit still, think no thoughts, and wait for this presence to announce itself, which it may do in spoken words, or it may do in just giving you an impression that you instantly understand, or by producing in you this deep breath, or by taking a weight off of your shoulders and feeling them drop back. Now, this is spiritual healing. This is Christ healing. This, you see, is that weapon, that stone that is carved out of the side of a mountain without hands. It is something that has no form, no substance to our sense, that is, material substance, no strength, no power, and even as a voice it may only whisper. And yet, It is sufficient to raise the dead, the dying. It is sufficient to heal the most serious forms of disease. You might wonder why it doesn't do it all the time. Usually, when there is a practitioner healing through the Spirit, it will do it all the time, except where there is a block in the patient's consciousness. And that block that is in there has to do with the very things that they will not release or give up. They are clinging to some form of materiality while they are asking the Spirit to take over and relieve them from materiality. In other words, they want to swim across the lake, but they're holding on to the pier with one hand and moving the other hand and standing still. And very often we, at certain stages of our unfoldment, are willing to give everything up but this one thing, or this other thing, or that thing. And we cling to some form of visible effect, some form of visible form, tangible form to human sense. It may be the dollars we cling to, or it may be the companionships we cling to, it may be the fame or fortune we cling to, but it may be our hates, our animosities, or our prejudices, biases, or bigotries. They all act as mental blocks within us, and with them we may not receive the spiritual light that we are seeking. The spiritual path is really a path of sacrifice, not asceticism, sacrifice of anything that may stand in the way of its unfoldment, and you or I are not able to judge what those things are. They announce themselves to us, and that's that. In other words, people have asked me, will I be more spiritual if I give up meat? Oh, that all depends. You certainly will if you've been told within to give it up. No question about it, that the time has come, and you've been told so, and that's that. To disobey is to lose your demonstration. And another person may be told to give up outward forms of worship. And if they're not quite ready for it, they forfeit that. Others are told to go to some quiet place for a while. Ah, yes, but you know how it is. The payroll has to be met every week, or the rent every month, and those things are postponed. No one knows but the individual themselves what their instructions are. Asceticism does not enter the picture, but the sacrifice of material and mental things that bind must be released. Now, there are different states and stages of consciousness, and these are not all spiritual or mystical. There is a contact with the cosmic consciousness, which is not necessarily spiritual or mystical. And an attachment to that cosmic consciousness can result in artists, writers, inventors, who are not necessarily mystical, spiritual. They are more universal, but in the sense of a human universality. The great inventor of Schenectady, what's the name? Steinmetz, yes. He told us that in this coming age, the greatest advance was going to be made along spiritual lines and the discovery of spiritual power. Now, evidently, he hadn't discovered it. What he discovered was the cosmic, and out of it he could draw every law of nature, mechanical law, natural law, which had nothing to do with spiritual law, because spiritual law operates without physical form. In other words, out of the cosmic could come the idea of an automobile, but out of the spiritual would come the idea of instantaneity, of just closing your eyes in Chicago and blinking them and all of a sudden being in New York, London, and Paris. That would come out of the spiritual. In the same way that Brown Landon taught the mental, which is an offshoot of the cosmic. I have watched him in Florida sit in a chair surrounded by others, while 3 men in London took a book down off the shelf and opened it on their table, and Brown Landon read that whole page of the book to them. That wasn't spiritual, that was mental. That was proving the universality of mind. His mind was not locked up in a body. His mind was not in Florida. His mind was a universal mind. And in that same way, he could enter the pyramids at any time of the day or night. He could just close his eyes, go into the pyramids, and take down anything he wanted from there, or any other place on the face of the globe. He could be instantly where he wanted to be mentally, and he could tell you what was there. He could write it down for you, and then you check, and that's the way it was. That is not spiritual. That is mental and cosmic, universal. The spiritual would not bring back such human knowledge, but would bring back spiritual wisdom, spiritual law, spiritual grace, spiritual powers. Now, these are but differing degrees of consciousness. The material consciousness, the mental consciousness, the cosmic consciousness, the transcendental, these are all states and stages of one. The one infinite consciousness is God or Spirit. But as a materialist, you are looking out through a very physical, finite sense of consciousness. And as you grow mentally, and your mental scope broadens, and now you are less physical, less material, and you are looking out from a wider scope, upon a wider horizon. You're the same person and you have the same mind, but you have now entered a larger vision of that mind, a larger scope of that mind. And so you go on perhaps to the cosmic, and there you can write books or write plays, do paintings, artwork of any nature, music even, that isn't of a spiritual nature, more of a cosmic nature. And then as you go on into the transcendental, music comes out of that sphere, but only a few of the great composers have touched that part of consciousness where the music that they bring forth is neither mental nor cosmic, but is actually of the nature of the spirit itself. In the same way, there are very few artists who have gone beyond the cosmic. And the few have seen visions way beyond it. Their artwork is very little understood. So it is in the realm of literature. Most of that which is called mystical literature is not mystical at all. It is usually either cosmic or occult, and has to do with the mental range of consciousness. The actual spiritual or mystical you can recognize quickly, because it transcends anything that man knows. And it will always bring a quick denial from all the universities, because it can't be true. That would be, of course, such things as the Gospel of John, the Aeneads of Plotinus, and the writings that began to come through Boehme, and so forth. There is much in the way of mystical literature which testifies to the fact that the Spirit of God wrote it or dictated it. Not man, and not the mind of man, nor anything that could be conceived by the mind of man. But the Spirit of God uttered it. That is the words of Jesus Christ in the Gospel of John and in a few of the other Gospels. Certainly the Sermon on the Mount was spoken by the voice of God. The Ten Commandments were not voiced by the voice of God. The Ten Commandments came out of cosmic consciousness, law. Law came by Moses out of cosmic consciousness. And when he said the voice of God thundered, you can bet it wasn't the still small voice that thundered. It was the voice of cosmic law. But the Sermon on the Mount is spirit. When it says, resist not evil, you can be, and judge not that ye be not judged, you can be assured of this, that you're not hearing any pronouncement of man or mind or law. You are hearing the words of spirit itself. Now, in order to bring forth spiritual literature, it is necessary that one be aware of a transcendental presence. Or let us say this, it isn't a question of being of necessity, because you can't command it. It is a question of actual fact, that there is a something present which is voicing itself, and what it is saying transcends the knowledge of the person that is uttering it or those who are hearing it, so that it comes as new and fresh and startling sometimes to the one who's voicing it, as much so as to those that are hearing it. Because it isn't anything known by man. It is something that for the first time is being revealed to man through the consciousness of one who has risen above his own mind, to where his own mind isn't functioning except as an avenue of awareness, as a vehicle through which the Spirit is uttering itself. Such literature is always recognized. Such literature always endures for ages and ages and ages and ages. Now, as I said before, the spiritual living is guided by that thing. That is why you cannot always act according to the way your friends believe is sensible and intelligent. That is why you sometimes defy the very things that are common sense. Because you're under the instruction and the guidance and the care and protection of that which knows what we as humans can never know. There's an experience of that in this man Letourneau, the builder of earth-breaking machinery, earth-moving machinery, when he became bankrupt. And it puzzled him because he not only had wonderful inventions and he was amply capitalized, he knew he had a good idea and he knew everything was wonderful and he had plenty of business, but he went bankrupt. And he tried to figure it out while he was going through the bankruptcy courts awaiting his discharge. And one day, while he was sitting there pondering it, it came to him as clearly as if a voice had spoken it. You had everything in your business but God. You failed to take God into your business. And then he realized that actually that was what happened. And so he made himself a promise that when he was reorganized and back in business again, that 10% of his earnings would be taken out for whatever it was that he called God purposes. He bought Bibles in all languages and sent them all over the world. He financed Bible courses and Bible institutes and a lot of other things that have to do with religion and that constituted his highest sense of religion. And he prospered with his tithing, I guess to such an extent that he felt ashamed of that 10% he was mailing off, so he increased it to 20%. And as you probably know, today he gives 80% of his earnings to religious purposes and keeps 20% for himself. And I read last year where that 20% was either $1.5 million or $3 million, I've forgotten which. Enough to get by with anyhow. You see, to our limited sense, it would seem that we have $10. And that $10 has to be spread in so many ways, and that leaves nothing over. And spiritual sense says, I haven't got $10, I only have $9. And so I have to spread that over, because I'm determined that this one is going to go to impersonal uses. And then very soon it does become apparent that this 9 is not only meeting all the needs, but it's leaving 50 cents over. And so we share that 25 cents out of the 50 and so forth. Now, there have been others. There was a man in Milwaukee who was an unemployed man also. And he promised God that if he ever got employment again, 10% would go to God's purposes. Well, the first position he got was at $20 a week. After many weeks of unemployment, and his wife was very happy to hear they were going to have money again, but she was shocked to find on the first payday that he come home with only $18 and she was expecting $20. And then he reminded her of his promise to God. Oh, well, yes, I knew you made that promise, but at least after we're on our feet. No, we got along with nothing. We can get along with $18. And that man also continued until he was giving 80% away and keeping 20%. And with that 20%, he was a very, very well-to-do man in Milwaukee. You see, the Spirit multiplies loaves and fishes. Humanly, you can't do that, and you can't stretch a dollar beyond its scope. But spiritually, the dollars can be multiplied endlessly and endlessly. When that Spirit is upon one, the instructions come. How much to give, when to give, where to give, how to give. And all one has to do is not decide to do it, just be obedient when it comes. Because the same power that tells you to do it prospers it. The same power that instructs carries out the instruction. He performeth that which is given me to do, which is appointed for me. Yes, the point it doesn't make clear there is, though, that he not only performs it, but he's the one that appointed it for me to do it, and that's why he performs it. He also appointed it. So it is when we are in obedience to the still small voice, not only that we have been instructed what to do, but we're also assured that we don't have to do it, that it is going to be done in us, for us, through us, as us, so forth and so on. Now, in countries like Egypt or India, Tibet, it has never been difficult to live this life, or the Holy Lands, for the simple reason that there were no abstractions, nothing to detract thought and attention. There was plenty of quiet, plenty of peace, plenty of leisure. There was no urge to earn a lot of money because wants were simple and means of fulfilling those wants ample. And in the mystical state of consciousness, or transcendental state, one isn't interested in acquiring. And so it was a simple matter to live the spiritual life and demonstrate it. In the Western world, it has always been difficult because it's always been a materialistic world, and it's always been a mechanical world, and more so now than ever before. And only with the power that we attain through constant meditation is it possible to live spiritually, that is, under spiritual guidance and direction. Without recourse to meditation, frequent meditation, this whole thing would be lost. One would become separated from a conscious awareness of that presence, not from the presence. The presence is true, and it says, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. As I was with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, so I am with you. And I will be with you unto the end of the world. But that isn't of much benefit to us, with the telephone bell ringing and the airplanes overhead and the banging back and forth of all the different noises, unless we find it within our powers to withdraw from the outer senses into that inner sanctuary, where even though those noises take place, we're not aware of them. All kinds of noises can be going on around us, and we're not aware of them. There is a direct contact with this inner selfhood. There is an inner communion, and no amount of outside disturbances ever interfere with it. The only exception to that rule is in the case of those who are living so deeply in the spirit that they are apt to get into such a deep meditation sometime as to almost, you may say, leave the body or leave the world. And then an unexpected interruption, or the ringing of a telephone bell, or the banging at a doorway, may, of course, not be a very pleasant thing to the nervous system or to the health, because one is almost disconnected from their senses during those periods. In the days of my work in an office, whenever I was going to have a meditation of any duration, I would cut off the telephone. I would close the doors and be sure that no one. I even had double doors so as not to hear any outside noises. Because there is an intensity of experience. After a while, when you find that more or less you're living in that consciousness all of the time, seldom out of it, then it's quite different. Then these outside noises, regardless of their nature, just do not break through, except on the rarest of occasions. It is like living in an insulated way. One is inside the spirit, and the outer movements are just functional. They're just mechanical. They're not directed, and there's no conscious thought involved in them. That takes place in treatment, in spiritual healing. When you are in that spirit and sometimes say things to your patient or student that shocks them and afterward surprises you, because it wasn't consciously said or consciously written. It was something that came forth right from the spirit. And if it was well received, it performed its function, did its work, and healing took place. If it was rejected, as sometimes happens, I have had students get insulted at me, and not for anything that I was consciously aware of, but for something I said or something I wrote that came right up out of the spirit, but which they weren't ready at that time to take because it offended their personal sense or something else. It does that because you do not know. No human being can be a spiritual healer. It is the transcendental consciousness that does it. It perceives the need and it meets it, and without any consideration. You remember the disciple's statement of the Master, that's a hard saying, and he said, go and leave me. Well, where shall we go? Thou hast the word of God. And so it is that, well, it says if your right hand offend thee, cut it off. The eye offend thee, pluck it out. And that's what happens sometimes when the Spirit speaks. It offends our human sense of what's right or wrong. And then it's just a question whether we want to go on as we were, or whether we're ready to cut off that hand or pluck out that eye and say, I'm relying on the Spirit. How, or rather, is it possible for an individual to set out to attain that consciousness? Well, I frankly don't know. I have no way of knowing. I have seen this, that those who had a leading to find God or find truth, some eventually came to that awareness, that consciousness. But I think if they had that specifically in mind, that they might find it a barrier. I think that would be something like I've said before, that if I were a music teacher and somebody came to me and said, I want to study music with you because I want to be a concert player or concert singer, I think I'd say to them, I don't think I'd care to be your teacher. You find somebody else that can make you a concert player or a concert singer. But if somebody came to me and said, oh, I love music, I want to know all the music there is in the world, I think that you could take that person and not only teach the music, but turn them into a concert player or a concert singer. But you see, the desire to be a concert singer or a concert player is really a feeding of the ego. But seeking to know music, that's something entirely different. The same with this. I don't know that what a person thinks they're going to do with this after they get it, if this is what they're seeking. But I do know this, that those who never had such a thing as this in mind, and by this I mean the mystical experience or the transcendental consciousness, those who merely felt there is a God, and a God that can be known. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jesus, John, Paul, Buddha, Lao Tzu, Shankara. These people all knew God. Why can't I? What have they got that I haven't got? And so that love, that instinct comes to seek God, to know God aright. And having no desire beyond knowing Him aright, this other thing can take place. With some people it takes place spontaneously, as it did with Walt Whitman. But they are few and far between. Those who are born with it are still fewer and still far apart. As a rule, it comes through this inner longing to know God. And then it either takes place spontaneously within one, or one finds a spiritual teacher who has been that way before, and who at a given moment, not a moment of your choice or the teacher's choice, but at a certain moment, when all the necessary things have been fulfilled, the light of the teacher's consciousness illumines the student, and then the student comes into the full awareness of their true identity, of the transcendental experience. See the eye? And when that takes place, the student is just as free and independent as the teacher. The student then is in the full and complete realization of their true identity and of the identity of every man, woman, and child in the world. Now, through this spiritual eye, you see the heart of nature. You see the heart of an individual. You see the heart of a leaf of grass. You see the heart of a flower. You see the heart of a stone. There's no such thing as dead matter. There's no such thing in all the world as dead matter. Everything there is lives and breathes. And everything there is has a soul. There are souls in stones. There are souls in trees. Not in. Because even that which we call souls really is just the one soul, interpreted at different levels. But nothing exists without a soul power. Seen materially, a stone is a stone. Seen mentally, a stone can be a weapon. Seen spiritually, a stone is really a little spark of God, a jewel, a gem. And strangely enough, incorporeal. It has form, structure, color, beauty, but it hasn't density. So with a tree. A tree has form, light, beauty, color, grace, but it has no density. You can stick your hand right through the biggest redwood tree. It has no density, perceived through the transcendental consciousness. And that is the consciousness which overshadows the individual. And the mind of the individual is nothing more than an avenue of awareness. It's a relaxed factor, if any. In some cases it may not even be a factor. It may just be standing there dormant while this transcendental faculty is alerted and present. Now, in this state of consciousness, in this where the transcendental consciousness is as close as breathing, spiritual healing takes place, because there is no directed thought, there is no conscious thought, no criticism, no condemnation, no judgment. There is a complete cessation of human will or desire, even the will or desire to heal. Do you remember that I've said to you that the desire to be a practitioner is error? The desire to be a teacher is error? Well, I mean it. That's absolutely true. One has to be completely desireless for the spiritual consciousness to be in operation. And then, without any directing of it, without any trying to influence it, it functions. And it functions in its way. I don't think it functions to remove lumps or fevers. It functions to change consciousness. And when it changes consciousness, the new consciousness, of course, has no lumps or bumps or fevers. And so, all those physical manifestations disappear. Always remember, there must be a changed consciousness before there can be a changed form of demonstration. Never forget that. With all your getting, get a transformed state of consciousness, or you will not get a transformed state of health, because you are not going to get God just to move your body around. You are not going to get the Spirit to manipulate the organs and functions of your body. You can get medicine to do it, and massage to do it, and surgery to do it, but you can't get God. The one thing that God can do is transform your consciousness from its present state to a higher state of illumined consciousness, and that higher illumined consciousness outpictures itself as what we would call a healthier state of matter or body.